This is From Now On. I'm Lisa Phillips. Today, I want to talk about something that isn't always discussed around the holidays. While so many are enjoying moments of joy and comfort and love, there are others, too many, who are navigating one of the hardest seasons of their lives. I'm talking about survivors of intimate partner violence. For many survivors, the weight of financial abuse is one of the heaviest burdens they carry. Did you know that in 99% of abusive relationships, financial abuse is present? It's not just about stealing money or withholding funds. It's about control, cutting off access to bank accounts, sabotaging work opportunities, racking up debt in someone else's name. It's another form of isolation, a calculated effort to keep someone trapped. And when they finally break free, they often leave with little more than the clothes on their back. Imagine that, leaving everything behind, not just the bad, but the good, your home, your memories, your stability. And in its place, mountains of financial uncertainty and systemic barriers at every turn. Let's examine the bigger picture here. This is where it gets even harder to stomach because it's not just about the abuser, it's about the systems that profit from this pain. Just think about it. The media loves a scandal, but it often sensationalizes abuse, casting doubt on survivors and protecting those in power. And the judicial system? It's a grueling, expensive maze that survivors must navigate, usually all alone and often without the resources to fight back. And even law enforcement can be dismissive, failing to take the steps needed to protect those who are most vulnerable. It's a cycle, and it's heartbreaking, but it's not hopeless. So let's talk about solutions, about the things we can do to create change, to support survivors, and to chip away at these broken systems. First, let's start with education. Financial literacy is life-changing. When we teach survivors how to budget, save, and rebuild their credit, we give them tools for independence. And when we push for financial education in schools, we plant seeds for future generations to spot financial abuse before it takes root. Second, we can hold the media accountable. Challenge the narratives that shame survivors or cast doubt on their experiences. Challenge the narratives that focus and exploit on the violence they experience, and amplify voices that tell the truth about abuse, and support outlets that prioritize survivor-centered stories. Third, we can invest in survivors, whether it's donating to funds that provide direct financial assistance, volunteering your time, or helping someone build their resume. These small acts can make a big difference. But maybe the most powerful thing we can do is believe survivors. Just believe them. Your belief can be the first step in their healing. You see, abuse thrives in isolation. It silences, separates, and steals a person's sense of self. But healing happens in community. This is why building supportive networks is so vital. When a survivor knows they're not alone, that there are people who will listen without judgment, who will offer help without strings, they can begin to see a path forward. This time of year, we're reminded of the power of giving, of connection, and of hope. And for survivors, hope is everything. Hope that they can rebuild, hope that they can create a life free from fear, and hope that their story isn't over. So as we gather with loved ones this holiday season, let's not forget those who are starting over. Let's commit to being part of the solution, whether it's through action, advocacy, or simply showing up for someone in need. We all have a role to play in creating a world where survivors can thrive. To anyone listening who has experienced abuse, know this: your past does not define you. There's a community waiting to uplift you, to believe in you, to walk with you as you rebuild. You are so much stronger than you know, and your future is brighter than you can ever imagine. From my heart to yours, I wish you peace, love, and above all, hope. Today's guest is Sonya Passi. She's the founder and CEO of FreeFrom, a national organization transforming our society's response to gender-based violence so that survivors and their families can thrive. To date, FreeFrom has served over 30,000 survivors and successfully changed policy to support the financial security of over 5.3 million survivors in the U.S. Sonya has been an anti-violence activist since she was 16 years old. For her work in this field, Sonya was awarded the 2024 Elevate Prize and listed in Forbes 30 Under 30 class of 2017 for law and policy. She has presented on her work to the UN, White House, members of Congress, and federal agencies, several major corporations, and various city and state agencies and commissions. Most recently, she was featured in the powerful documentary Survivor Made, which follows 6 survivors of gender-based violence as they strive to grow their businesses during a make-or-break holiday season in Los Angeles. I am grateful today to welcome Sonya to From Now On. Welcome, Sonya.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So happy you're here.
Thank you.
So, Sonya, you started your career in the law. Has your focus always been survivors of abuse?
Yeah. When I was 16 years old, I thought that I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And so I started an Amnesty International group at my high school that year. And their campaign was global violence against women. And so you send away for all of these pamphlets and activities to do activism around. And I remember reading page 2, bullet point 1 of this pamphlet said 1 in 3 women globally will be subjected to gender-based violence. And I just remember being so shocked that this was the first time I was learning this, that this was not breaking news every single day, front page of every single newspaper. And at the time, I didn't have any words for my own experience. But I immediately was like, this is my issue. This is what I'm going to spend my life working on. And so during high school, I started hosting domestic violence awareness weeks. I went on to college and started a group that was educating campus students about intimate partner violence. And then I chose to go to law school specifically because this had been introduced to me as a human rights issue. And I felt like having a really strong grasp of law and policy and how you change both was going to help me figure out how I was going to end gender-based violence. So it's really my life's work. And I had the very good fortune of being 16 when I figured that out.
Yeah, it's pretty young to know exactly what your calling is going to be.
Yeah.
So what was the driving factor to transition from traditional law to founding FreeFrom?
Yeah, so although I went to law school, I've never practiced law. I never took the bar. I never practiced law. I really went because I wanted to understand this issue and how to solve it. And so I chose to go to Berkeley Law. They have one of the best domestic violence law programs in the world. And during my second year of law school, I started my first nonprofit organization in this space. It's called the Family Violence Appellate Project. It's based in Oakland. It serves the whole state of California. And basically, it is creating good laws in California for survivors. So it's been around now for almost 13 years. And because of this organization, California has the greatest protections for survivors of all 50 states. And it was during the creation of that organization that I learned 2 things. One is this is an economic issue. There are economic causes, there are economic consequences. Over and over again, I was meeting survivors who had left an abusive situation 3, 4, 5 years ago. And every single person I was meeting was homeless and economically devastated. They were living in their car. They were living on someone's couch. And these were survivors who had lost custody of their children because they couldn't afford to care for them. And this kept happening over and over again. And these women would say to me, everybody in my community shamed me for staying and said that I was hurting my children by staying in the abuse. And now I'm out and my children are still in the abuse. And I wish that I was still there to protect them. And so that's when I really understood that this isn't a one-off. This is happening over and over. What are we doing to address the economics of this? And I really, at that point, I did my due diligence. I talked to hundreds of survivors and activists and saw we just treat this issue in our society like it's a humanitarian crisis, like it's a hurricane that came through the town and here's a warm bed and a hot meal and a couple weeks of support and then good luck on be on your way. This is a systemic problem. And I learned through that how I was going, like what my offering to this movement was going to be, which was to infuse it with that long-term focus on the economics and on the systemic piece of it. So I came out of law school with the idea for FreeFrom. And
so can you explain exactly what it is?
Yeah. So FreeFrom is a national organization here in the US that is transforming our approach from this short-term crisis intervention to a long-term systemic economic approach. So we do everything from, we have direct services for survivors. We provide emergency cash if survivors need it to spend however they need. We have a savings matching program for survivors where we're matching survivors' savings dollar for dollar until they get to $1,600 in savings. We have our social enterprise gifted by FreeFrom that is an online store exclusively selling products made by survivor entrepreneurs.
Oh, that's great.
And then the whole store is operated by survivors we employ for $38 an hour to run the store. We have community groups of survivors who are working to build their financial security together and share resources and share expertise. So those are like our direct service offerings for survivors. And then we have our kind of systems change approach, which is if this is a systemic problem, it means that we are all responsible for it, whether we are perpetuating it or we are solving for it.
Or enabling it.
Exactly. And so we work with financial institutions. We work with local, state, and federal governments. We work with employers to do their part. So we've been able to get a number of employers to implement paid and protected leave for survivors so that they are not having to use their sick and vacation days and they're not having to lose their job because they need to get safe. We've been able to pass so many different laws in different states that enable survivors to, for example, break a lease in an emergency if they need to and not face penalties. And so really getting all the different pillars of our society to do their part. Then the last piece of our work is narrative change. And, you know, we want everyone to play their part, but how do you get everyone to play their part to solve a problem that nobody wants to look at? And all of our media and visual representations of this issue are gratuitous violence and hopelessness and tragedy. I don't want to watch. 99%.
It.
Exactly. So we are creating content that encourages people to turn towards the issue, that shows survivors joy and survivors power and shows people the solutions, because most people in our society just accept that gender-based violence is here forever. And if we don't believe we can solve something, we won't try. And so I think there's a huge role of storytelling to play in helping people invest in solving this problem.
Yeah, so many people think that, oh, this is just how it is, and just deal with it. I've been really shocked at how many people have just said that.
And quite frankly, I think a lot of people that do this work on a daily basis don't fully believe that we can end it. And we need that. We can't do anything if we don't believe in it.
No, you have to believe in it. For a real change to happen. I was watching an interview of yours and you said something that really resonated with me. You said care is wealth. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that and how it's embodied in FreeFrom's work?
Everything that FreeFrom does, we operate from a place of abundance and generosity. What is the most abundant thing to do? What is the most generous thing to do?
Right.
Our motto is trust survivors. And so everything is done from that point. So at the beginning of the pandemic, listening to survivors in our community and what they were experiencing, we said, let's give survivors cash. And, you know, many of the people that were funding us wanted to know how we were going to make sure that cash was spent in an appropriate way. And
yes, I was thinking, how are they going to know how to manage it properly?
yeah. And we just said, we trust survivors, you know? And so when I think about care as wealth, at the end of our lives, you know, we die penniless. We're born penniless, we die penniless.
That's true.
But what we leave at the end of our lives is a community that we've built. And the greatest currency, or the greatest antidote to our loneliness, the greatest assurance of our safety, is care for each other and community. We hosted the first ever Survivor Wealth Summit a couple of years back. And I intentionally called it the Survivor Wealth Summit because I wanted to use the word wealth. It is so expensive to be subjected to gender-based violence that it takes wealth to heal from it. But I also knew that the word wealth makes people really uncomfortable. And so when we came into the space, we had about 300 survivors, and we left it open to the community at this conference to decide how they defined wealth. And at the end of the conference, the collective definition that everyone got to was community and care is wealth. And
I almost think that puts it on the same playing level, because when you say wealth, it's usually the wealthy that are protected. So it puts them like, no, we're wealthy as well.
Yeah. The only reason that gender-based violence is as prevalent of an issue in our society is because there is no care. And there is no community accountability for the issue. So everyone takes a step back. Everyone says, that's not my problem.
Yeah, it turns a blind eye.
And it becomes this, I don't even know what you call an issue of this magnitude. It becomes this global crisis because there was no care along the way.
Yeah. There's a systemic money problem for survivors. We know that in 99% of abusive relationships, there's financial abuse. We also know that our economy profits from abuse, like you were saying, the media, the judicial system, law enforcement, and many more. So today we want to talk about solutions. How can we, the everyday human, support survivors? And what is our role in making that systemic change? At FreeFrom, you are all working on solutions to support survivors, and I'd like to touch base on all those efforts. In your work with FreeFrom, what is the biggest immediate need for survivors?
What we know at this point, we have served over 10,000 survivors in cash, getting them cash.
Wow.
What we know is that their number one need is cash. And sometimes it's $100 or $200 that is the difference between making ends meet or having to go back to an abuser or having to put yourself in an unsafe situation, losing your apartment. The average that survivors say they need to stay safe for a month is $730. In comparison, we know that every time the police are called to a domestic violence incident, it costs a little over $5,000. So, you know, you said earlier, our economy profits from gender-based violence. I think there are people that profit from gender-based violence. But actually, if we were successful in ending gender-based violence, if we invested in survivors, we would keep so much more money in our economy, and we would infuse so much more money into our economy. Like, ending gender-based violence is good for our economy, but it requires that we divest from power being held only by a few.
Tell us about FreeFrom's savings matching program.
I talked a little bit earlier about how there's only ever support at this moment of acute crisis. But what we know is that this is not a momentary problem. This is a problem that we are dealing with over years, and more often than not, generations. And so when I talk about how we need to expand the continuum of support before a moment of acute crisis and long after a moment of acute crisis, that means thinking about like a survivor 8 years after they leave a situation that's abusive, who's living paycheck to paycheck, who's barely making ends meet. Again, because the economic devastation of the abuse is so great.
Yeah, because a lot of times they like ruin your credit.
Exactly.
Or,
destroyed credit, debt in your name.
Yeah.
You know, you had to leave the workforce for X years, so you
Right.
missed out on certain promotions.
So you're playing catch up for
You're playing
years.
catch up. We know from survivors that they have about $0 in savings on average. So what that means is you're an unexpected bill, like a parking ticket away from financial devastation. You might be 10 years out of an abusive situation, but you're so physically, you cannot be physically safe if you're financially unsafe.
Yeah, that's true.
And so
yeah, a lot of people don't think about that.
Right.
You can't be physically safe unless you're financially safe.
Right. One requires the other. And so we started the savings matching program to meet survivors where they were at. What can you save? You can save $10 a month. We'll match you 10. And we keep working with survivors until they get to this $1,600 in savings. And it's working. And of course, one of the things that people said to us at the beginning when we started this program was, well, survivors don't have any money. And it's about breaking down this myth of who is a survivor. Because if you only think a survivor is that person at a life or death moment who grabs the keys, grabs the kids and runs, you're missing this entire spectrum of people who are in a position in their life where they could put $10 in their savings, especially if they know it's going to turn into $20 and then $1,600. And until we have a better understanding of who survivors are and their full diversity of experiences, we're not going to build solutions that meet them at those various points in their lives. And so the savings matching program is really intended for people who are not in immediate crisis, but they're very precariously close to the next crisis.
Okay. So that's the My Next Steps program.
Well, so the My Next Steps program it's for everyone. And it's a community of survivors coming together on different topics sometimes each week, every 2 weeks.
There's like meetups.
They're meetups.
Okay.
I mean, they're virtual right now. We have dreams to make them in person. But it's,
I would think that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it accomplishes two things. What we know is how isolating abuse is, and that's how it thrives. So how can we break down the isolation? Well, also supporting people in building financial security. So there might be one meetup where everyone's talking about like how do I check my credit score?
Right.
What do I do if I see X, Y, or Z? And we really operate from this approach that we as FreeFrom don't have any more information than you do. And that actually the wealth of knowledge exists in the room and each survivor has something to teach someone else.
That's true.
And it's not a top-down approach, and it's really recognizing the knowledge that exists in the room and that knowledge sharing because we will not solve this problem if we rely on a small number of nonprofits. This really has to be survivors building collective and community power. And so I always think about how can we facilitate that in different ways.
and also the community of knowing that you're not alone.
Yeah.
I think that's
I mean, how
also
powerful that
right.
is.
No, I was thinking that's what it was for me too.
Yeah.
Talking to people who are going through the same thing.
Yeah.
And like you said, learning from them.
Yeah.
So also, what's the compensation compass? Can you tell me
Yeah,
more
the
about
compensation compass. Okay, so people don't know this,
Mm.
but you can actually get money if you have experienced gender-based violence. And there's different ways that
Okay.
you can get this money.
You mean like grants?
You can get money from the person who's harmed you.
Oh, you're talking, okay.
That's obviously harder to get and requires a lot more investment of time.
Right. Court, right?
It can be court. I mean,
Mhm.
there's two ways that you can get this compensation. You can get it through small claims court. So you can get up to $10,000
Okay.
through a small claims court, which is a much lower lift of a process. The other is multi-year lawsuit where you are filing for damages.
But then it also costs a lot of money too.
It costs a lot. Well, as the plaintiff in that case, as the one bringing the case for money, you don't pay unless you win.
Okay. Okay. That's good. Yeah.
So that is good. And there have been many cases where, particularly against high profile harm doers, where people have gotten multi-million dollar, settlements or wins. But also each state has a fund called the Victims of Crime Compensation Fund that you can apply to as a survivor to get money for the harm you've experienced. And that is a form that you fill out basically, and you attach certain documents or certain, pieces of evidence, and then you can get compensation.
Do you help them through that process?
So we created this tool that allows you, and every state has a different process for all of this. So we created this tool that you can click on your state and you answer a certain number of questions, and it will tell you, based on your situation, this is probably the best route for you and how to go about it. Here's the form. Here's how long you have to fill it out. This is where you have to mail it to or email it to or upload it to.
Oh, so it guides you through step by step.
Yeah, it guides you through it.
That is so nice.
That I've always been very clear with FreeFrom, we're a national organization. I want to reach as many survivors as possible. We are not going to be able to create the kind of structural change we want around this issue if we are doing everything one by one by one.
Right, yeah.
So wherever I can, I'm like, how can we give survivors the information and put it out there and not have to, not make people reliant on being in constant conversation with us just to get their needs met.
Right.
So we've had, over 15,000 people use the compensation compass since we launched it.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People are so far getting what they need from it.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Gifted by FreeFrom?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Gifted is our social enterprise. So one of the very first programs that I started at FreeFrom was an entrepreneurship program.
I love this.
And I was seeing a lot that 9 to 5 minimum wage work was not going to give survivors.
It's not going to cut it.
It's not going to cut it. It's too expensive to be a survivor. And the demands on your time when you are recovering from abuse are so great.
Yeah.
And so kept having people lose their job because they're now single parents. And we worked with one survivor who had a job, full-time job, and her kid was in preschool, and, the teacher calls and says, your kid's got a fever, you got to come pick them up. And the employer says, if you leave work, you're fired. And that happens over and over, and she couldn't keep a job.
Right. And usually the job is only paying for the daycare.
Exactly. It's extraordinarily expensive. And so I also felt like, okay, entrepreneurship gives people flexibility about when they work. And so the first program we started was this entrepreneurship program. And we worked across 3 shelters in LA, Oakland, and San Francisco. And we worked with 24 survivors to start their businesses. And we work with them every week on whatever, there was no set curriculum. It was whatever you wanted to work on that week.
Okay.
So someone might want to work on their logo, and another one might want to go file their paperwork for their business or work on product development. And at the end of the 6 months, all the businesses had launched. All of them were making money.
Oh, that's great.
And supporting these survivors. And we got invited to the LA mayor's house for the holidays one year to have all the entrepreneurs sell their products. And everyone sold out.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then we did this Valentine's Day market in Santa Monica, and everyone sold out. And I was like, right, it's not just me that thinks these products are great. Like, customers are saying these products are great. What survivors were struggling with so much, though, was the marketing.
Yeah, I'm sure.
You know, like making themselves so public online in a way that didn't feel comfortable or safe. And just building an audience takes time.
Right. I would think sometimes they would be scared that that person is going to see that they're doing well.
Exactly. So I was like, well, FreeFrom has an audience. We have this huge community of people across the country who want to help. Why don't we become the marketplace? And so right before Mother's Day 2017, we launched Gifted as an online store only. That we sell curated gift boxes, including products from different survivors. We help them with everything: labeling, packaging, product development, and then we sell the products. And so Gifted has built itself, you know, a huge customer base at this point. And then as we were building the store, I said, okay, I don't want it to just be that we're supporting survivors in building their businesses. I also want us to create jobs for survivors that work for survivors. And so we started employing survivors to run the store. So everything from inventory to customer service to shipping and packaging is all done by the survivors we employ. And we're creating work that works for them. So hours are flexible.
Right.
It's really easy to learn the work. So people are able to pick up a small shift here, a small shift there. Everyone who works at the store, except one person, are parents.
Right.
So, you know, they'll leave to go pick up their kids or they'll come in after they've dropped their kids. So they're making the work for them.
Right. Yeah.
And in that way, creating a model of what survivor-informed work looks like.
Oh, that's super powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can work everything around your kids and then also
What
be
a
able to
novel
spend more
idea.
time with your children.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also just being an entrepreneur in general is just so, it's like, makes you feel really good. You know, so super empowering.
Yeah.
You know,
And
than
we've
just
had-
having a regular job that you're going to, working for somebody else. It's like, I'm creating this.
Yeah. I mean, that act of creation is is such a validation of your own power.
It is.
And we've had people who've worked at the store now go on to start their businesses because they've learned so much from the entrepreneurs that they work with. And even during COVID, I remember there was this point, you know, when we were in lockdown and schools were closed and everything was virtual, where the team came to me and they were like, we got to quit our jobs. Like, there's no way to educate our kids and work.
Oh, wow.
And so what we did was we brought in a teacher and we created a pod. And so they came to work every day and their kids came to school every day.
That's fantastic.
And it was like, what would have happened otherwise? Like, they would have gone from well-paying jobs to zero. What would that have done for their safety? And what did this scenario look like for everyone else out there who didn't have an employer who said, let's bring someone in to help with this because we don't want to lose you.
Right.
And so just all the ways in which workplaces are missing the fact that if you're employing people, you're employing survivors.
Right.
And if you're financially unstable, you're physically unsafe. So we have a responsibility as employers to do our part to ensure that survivors are safe.
Let's talk about society's role in the change that needs to happen to support survivors.
Yeah.
What are ways corporations can better support survivors?
There's so much corporations can do. You know, corporations hold an extraordinary amount of power. And part of it depends on what type of corporation it is, but...
Which is why it's so important to get them on board.
Exactly. At a minimum, a corporation is an employer. And 1 in 3 women, 1 in 2 trans people in the US are experiencing gender-based violence, which means if you're employing people, you're employing survivors.
Are you talking about in the workplace
Yeah.
or just in general?
In general.
In general, yes.
In general. So, you hire more than 3 people, odds are.
So that hasn't changed much since you noticed that in high school.
It really hasn't changed.
That's pretty sad.
I know. It really hasn't changed. And I saw a stat recently that said 1 in 2 women, and I need to fact check it.
1 in 2 women
experience gender-based violence. So if the number has gone up, which wouldn't surprise me, I would be devastated.
That makes, makes sense.
But as employers, we know a couple things. We know that survivors on average are depleting 11 days of sick or vacation to deal with being subjected to harm. So that looks like anything from getting a rape kit done to going to the hospital for broken bones to fleeing. And we know that 60% of survivors are losing their job as a result of the abuse.
Yeah.
Which tells you that the issue isn't that survivors can't get jobs, it's that survivors can't keep jobs.
Yeah, or the abuser is making sure they don't have a job.
Employers, corporations, employers have a huge role to play in ensuring that survivors can keep their job, that survivors are not having to use vacation and sick days to go and get a rape kit done.
To go heal. Because a lot of times they have bruises and they don't want to go into work.
Exactly. And so we have been successful in getting a number of big corporations, Facebook, Bumble, Berkshire Bank, Blue Shield of California, to implement paid and protected leave for survivors, which means it's separate than your vacation days. The city of Chicago has also implemented this. It's separate than your vacation days. It's separate than your sick days. It's really this very specific type of leave that is for survivors. And sometimes it's up to a month of leave that survivors can take specifically to deal with being subjected to this type of harm.
That's amazing, but also sometimes survivors don't want to speak up and let their boss or someone at the workplace, HR, know that they're being abused.
Yeah, and it's up to people whether they use it or not.
Okay.
But what we have found is that when an employer takes the step of implementing this leave, they destigmatize it and they de-shame it. And pretty much every employer that we know has implemented this, it's implemented in a way that you don't have to say anything except I'm requesting this leave.
Oh, okay. So you don't have to tell.
You don't have to tell your story. You don't have to provide any proof. So the barrier to accessing it is low, but it's like, at FreeFrom, we have unlimited menstrual leave. Menstruation is not the same as gender-based violence, but it is something that has a lot of shame around it. We don't tend to say, I'm on my period. And we also don't tend to say and acknowledge that we have pain.
Right, exactly. A lot of times you need to stay home on the day you have your period.
But when your employer says we have unlimited menstrual leave, it signals to you that that's not something that you should be embarrassed about. And that's not something that you should have shame about. And that's not something that your employer is expecting you to work through. And so that's where I say we have so much power as employers, and corporations hold so much power to change culture. To say, I, as a major corporation that benefits tremendously from our society, have a responsibility to survivors. And I bear some of that burden, because right now, the way it is in our society is survivors are the only ones bearing the burden of gender-based violence. But it is a societal problem. So it doesn't make any sense, let alone fairness, that survivors are the only ones bearing that burden. Our employers need to bear their burden. Our health insurance companies need to bear their burden. Our banks need to bear their burden. So the first way that corporations can do something is as employers. And then it depends on what type of company you are. If you're a health insurance company, can you make it so that if you have medical bills related to abuse, that you don't pay copays, that you're not on the hook for those bills? If you're a bank, can you make it so that survivors are able to have enhanced fraud protections on their bank accounts so that it's harder for someone to steal their money or physically monitor them by watching where they're making transactions?
Are banks open to that?
Banks are open to it. Smaller banks are very open to it. Bigger banks are open to it. But what they say is we are very heavily regulated. So we need the regulators to give us express permission to do this. So we're working on getting that express permission. So that's banks, that's health insurance companies, but really there's a role for everyone. If you're Airbnb,
right?
Can you portion off X percentage of homes for survivors who are fleeing? There's a role for everyone to play.
I never thought of that. That's a great idea.
And hotels,
right? Just
understanding what you have to offer, and understanding that you have a responsibility as a member of our society, and getting creative.
It's almost like everything that you're saying, there has to be like a shift in thought first.
Yeah.
To even say this is a huge epidemic. This is a problem.
Just saying like, this is my problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the first stage, the first step.
So FreeFrom is currently working on building a credit union, right?
Very excited about it.
For survivors. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So from the research that we've done, 58% of survivors have their bank account stolen from, controlled, or monitored.
58%. I would have thought it was higher than that.
I know. And that's 58% who have their own bank account. So it's, I'm sure, much higher when you think about joint accounts.
That's true. Most have a joint account.
Yeah, 58%, which is more than half. The only people that can act there are banks. So I mentioned earlier, we are working with banks to implement enhanced protections for survivors. But we also are working on creating this credit union, which has transformative power at so many different levels. At a ground level, it is an opportunity for the survivors who are members of this credit union to bank in a way that really works for them, that keeps their assets safe, that allows them to grow their financial security. If you're part of the credit union, you'll be able to be part of the savings matching program, to get emergency cash grants, to get financial safety planning tips. It also gives us an opportunity to create the gold standard of what banks should be doing. And doing it from the perspective of both being experts on the issue, but also understanding how the banking industry works and saying, this is the way to do it. So it allows us to create something that others can then take and implement in their own credit unions, in their own banks. And then at a next level up, there is this misconception in our society that there is nothing to be gained from supporting survivors. And what I am really excited to do is become so profitable as a credit union because survivors are such economically strong customers if you invest in them. And to disrupt this idea that survivors don't have money, that survivors aren't good with money, that survivors can't grow their money, all those misconceptions that are just rooted in misogyny.
Right.
And to really disrupt the banking industry by investing in survivors. And then at that top level, the way people pay attention to what for-profit businesses do versus nonprofits is huge. So our ability for impact, transforming the narrative, changing people's perceptions, making people pay attention as a profitable business is so much greater than just FreeFrom as the nonprofit that it's a story people will be talking about for a long time.
Definitely. How can state laws and policies better support survivors?
Okay. So a couple years back, we cataloged the laws of every single state, and we determined whether they supported survivors' financial security or hurt survivors' financial security. And then we graded every state. Most states are terrible. There's a couple of good ones. And then for each state, we were like, this is what you should change. This is how you could make it better. This is what you're missing. We gave them model legislation. And it's across so many different categories. And in the year that we were building it, we had to go keep making sure we hadn't missed any new laws that had been introduced. So in the year that we were building it, 10 new laws had been introduced over that period of time that supported survivors' financial security. Introduced, not passed, just introduced. In the 3 years since we built it, 600 have been introduced.
Wow.
And what we keep hearing from people is they didn't even realize that their state didn't have this or that. And when you're thinking about an issue as astronomical as gender-based violence, there's no one solution. There's no one law.
Right.
There's no one change. What you're actually talking about is millions of small steps and building blocks that need to be put in place to build the infrastructure of care that survivors need. So 600 laws, it's huge compared to what was happening before. It's nothing compared to the total that each state has 50 to 80 laws that need to be changed or introduced to do things like make it so that you can break a lease if you need to flee without experiencing penalties.
Are those laws in place?
In a few states.
Right.
We've been successful in a few states. There's many more states to go.
Which state is the best at supporting survivors?
California and Illinois are sort of neck and neck for the best, but neither one is yet like a model state. But they're doing better than others. Washington is doing well.
That's good.
But most states are like in what we call the doing nothing pile.
Well, it's probably doing nothing for many years, but now it's, you said, slowly getting better.
Slowly getting there. Or little things like litigation abuse. So litigation abuse, for people who don't know, is when a harm doer uses the court process to abuse you.
Yeah. Further manipulate you. And
that can look like anything from filing frivolous motions that drag you back to court and make you rack up tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. We once worked with a survivor who her harm doer was monitoring her email. And every single time she had a job interview scheduled, they would file a motion to drag them back to court. And the problem is if you don't show up to court when you're talking about custody, sometimes just by default, you lose custody.
You have to be there.
And so 7 job interviews in a row, she missed because she was pulled into court. That's litigation abuse. Litigation abuse, exactly for that reason, is a form of economic abuse.
It happens a lot.
It's so prevalent.
Yeah, I hear about that almost in every case.
It's so prevalent. So we've been successful in getting a number of states now to pass laws that say, if you engage in litigation abuse, you will be penalized, financially penalized, because that's the only way to stop it. We were able to get Tennessee, which is very much in the doing nothing to support survivors pile, to adopt the most robust definition of domestic violence. So they now include economic abuse in their definition of domestic violence.
Does that include financial abuse?
Yes.
The same thing.
Economic, financial, same thing.
Okay.
But most states pretty much define domestic violence as physical or psychological.
Physical.
Which means that if someone is stealing money from your bank account, you can't get a restraining order to stop them from doing that, because that's not considered physical or psychological. Or if someone is tracking your physical whereabouts through your bank transactions, that's not considered physical or psychological. So you can't. But in Tennessee now you can, and in a couple other states have been successful too. But Tennessee is a great example of it doesn't really matter the political leaning of the state. There's so much. These are small things that add up to so much.
Sure.
And if we break this problem down to the sum of its parts and kind of go step by step at a state level, at a federal level, within corporations, within our communities, we will start to see the sort of seismic shift that we need to, but we have to break it down to the million pieces. Otherwise, it seems too great. And we come back to that problem we talked about earlier, which is it seems so overwhelming to solve this problem that we just assume it's impossible.
Right. Well, because it seems impossible until you start doing these little baby steps and things get better and better.
Right. It's like our healing. If we think about the day then when we're healed, it seems so overwhelming, but it's, I book therapy for tomorrow. That's my step.
It is step by step.
I take a walk. I take a shower. These are the steps that add up to 7, 10, 15, 30 years later of being more healed.
What role should the federal government and policy take in supporting survivors?
Oh, there's so much for the federal government to do.
Well, that's most important, right?
Basically, right now, the federal government's response to gender-based violence is, for the most part, just limited to the Violence Against Women Act, which, quite frankly, is breadcrumbs of money to fund emergency services to deal with gender-based violence. When in actuality, when we're talking about a systemic problem, when we're talking about 1 in 3 women, 1 in 2 trans people, every single law that the federal government considers and passes needs to consider survivors. If it's a small business bill, how are we thinking about survivors in that? If it's an education bill, how are we thinking about survivors in that? The tax code, every single bill, every single issue area is a survivor issue area. And so at a high level, what the federal government needs to do is to understand that this is a demographic of people that really needs to be considered at every level of policymaking. One of the things that we're working on doing at a federal level is building a coalition in Congress of survivors, because there are survivors in Congress. And if you are thinking collectively about how will this impact survivors, that's a huge and powerful voice for survivors in the halls of power. And sometimes it just takes bringing it to consciousness. Like, I have so many identities, but if they're not all conscious for me, and if I'm not acting from those identities at all times, then I may be missing a perspective. And so that's something that we're going to be working on over the next couple of years.
That would be really big.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So tell me about the Survivor Wealth Policy Group.
So I mentioned earlier that we created this map and scorecard for all 50 states, and we've seen so many pieces of legislation introduced. FreeFrom is really committed to building a movement, building survivors' collective power, which means really creating community and expertise and being a resource for people that far extend beyond us. So the Survivor Wealth Policy Group is advocates, policymakers, survivors across different states who are like, we want to do something in our state. And so it's a community group. It's like, how did you do it? What was the obstacle you faced in your state? How can we make sure that we're conscious of that when we go to try to do this in our state? How can we dream up new policy ideas for survivors together, and really building these communities that are innovating solutions to the problem and using their expertise, so that, again, we have really big goals at FreeFrom. We cannot possibly accomplish those goals if we try to do everything ourselves. So at every level and every corner of what we do, it's how can we support others to go do this themselves. And
so you have these other groups that are in other states.
Yeah, and they're self-forming, and they come to us. And it's really, we're just there to be a resource where and when we can.
Okay.
But when you think about systems change work, when you think about transforming a paradigm, you can't ever trace that back to one person or one group.
Right. Okay.
And so FreeFrom will only be successful in our big lofty vision if there's so many people doing this across the country. And there's so many people that are feel resourced and mobilized to do this that one day someone has no idea where this credit union came from or why banks are now supporting survivors or, you know?
Are there any bills currently, whether state or federal, that you're particularly hoping of passing?
You know, across all 50 states right now, there's about 83 bills that are being considered that would support survivors' financial security. And anyone can go to our website, freefrom.org. And right there on the homepage, you can see our map and scorecard, and you can track all of the bills that are in progress right now. You can see how your state is faring.
Right.
You can see how
you need to see that. Yeah.
You can see how you can get involved in your state. You can contact your local representatives. So there's a lot of ways to engage with what's going on in your state and see what exciting developments are happening in other states.
That's awesome. Because you've been doing a lot of research. I mean, it looks like you've covered so many different. I mean, you've talked about so many things I wouldn't even have thought of.
Yeah, but the reason is because we just went and we asked survivors.
Right. Yeah. What do you need?
You know?
Yeah. What do you need? How can I help?
It's so simple, but you just ask people what they need and you'll learn so much.
What is your research right now focused on?
We have 2 big reports coming out next year that the first one is looking at survivors' experiences or survivors' needs in the workplace. So it's not focused on sexual harassment in the workplace. It's really, I'm a survivor and I work. And how does one impact the other? And that's how we learn that survivors are using 11 days paid on vacation time to recover from the harm they've experienced. And so we're excited to put that out and really show employers the role that they have to play here. And then the second big data set that we're working with right now, we went to survivors who are working in the movement to end gender-based violence. And we said, you are survivors working to help survivors. What do you need? What needs do you have that are being overlooked? What is your greatest hope for this work? What is your greatest vision? What ideas and solutions do you have that you think have not been considered or implemented or tried yet? And so that's almost like a collective vision for the movement manifesto that we're working on.
I can see that because survivors are not only looking out for themselves and getting a job and getting back on their feet, but they're also looking to help others.
I think
it's something that just happens within you, I think.
Exactly.
You have a collected consciousness of pain.
And often you're in the same struggle as the people that you're working to serve. So one of the things we learned really early on was survivors weren't being supported in building their financial security because the survivors who were serving them were not being supported in building their financial security. So how could they possibly support their clients in that way? And so one of the big things that we're always pushing for is we need, for this to be a sustainable movement, for this to be a survivor-led movement to end gender-based violence, survivors working in the movement need to be paid a living wage. They need benefits. They need health insurance. They need time off. They need paid and protected gender-based violence leave. And until we start from within and take care of ourselves, we don't have enough to offer. And we can't build a robust and effective movement.
I just want to thank Sonya for coming on From Now On. There's so much more you want to talk about, so we're going to pause here and continue this important conversation on next week's episode. This is From Now On. Thanks for joining me today. I am Lisa Phillips. Until next time, stay informed, stay empowered, and remember, there is strength in speaking out. And special thanks to our amazing guest, Sonya Passi. Elizabeth Wyndham is our senior producer. Christopher Leon is the editor. Corey Wynn is our director of photography. And Jose Oriana is our studio producer. Our theme music is Many Worlds by Memory Theory. If you have any thoughts, questions, or stories about your own views on topics discussed on From Now On, email us at fromnowonpod@gmail.com. And please follow, rate, comment, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If today's conversation resonated with you and you are seeking more support in your own healing journey, if you or someone you know has been sexually assaulted, help is available. Call 800-656-HOPE. If you or someone you know is being trafficked, contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Text 233-733. That's Be Free. PAVE is a 501c3 nonprofit creating a world free from sexual violence and building communities to support survivors. To learn more, go to shatteringthesilence.org. Speak Out, Act, Reclaim, SOAR, is dedicated to providing a safe and empowering space for survivors of sex trafficking to reclaim their stories and stand up for themselves and each other. That's www.speakoutactreclaim.org.